Doubles and seams. So we'll talk a little bit about RSpec Rails to get you ready for the idea of how are we going to test the controller, right? So where we are now is we know what the controller's job is. The controller's job is to receive the form input, make sure that it pulls stuff out of the form, make sure that that stuff gets correctly passed to this method that we have not written yet and does not exist, and if the method existed, make sure that the results of calling that method get forwarded, get made available to a view. Here are some things that are going to help us when we use the RSpec Rails gem, which adds some functionality to RSpec that lets us talk about the kinds of tests that you would put in a web app. For example, it will give us methods like get, post, and put, which simulate HTTP requests. Basically, you pass it a URI just like you would pass if you were putting it together in a web browser. And that takes care of going through the routing system, doing all the things so that by the time your test sort of wakes up, the controller method is the thing that it can focus on. So params have been parsed, the route has been resolved, all of those things have happened by the time your test sort of gets control of the situation. Another thing we get from RSpec Rails is this access to what's called the response object, which is basically at the moment the controller action finishes, the response object encapsulates what the controller is about to do. So for example, was the HTTP request successful and it's going to return an HTTP 200? Was there a view that was about to be rendered? And if so, which view was that? Was it going to end up being a redirect? And if so, what is the redirect URI that is about to be sent back? So at that point, nothing has actually happened, but there's this object that encapsulates a description of what is about to happen. And by looking at that object, that's where we're going to do most of our assertion of post conditions to ask, did the controller method do the right thing? Did it pass the test? We also get matchers that go along with that. Remember that a matcher is something that captures a kind of assertion you would want to make. Well, one assertion you might want to make is, was the controller about to render a particular view template? Or did the controller assign a particular instance variable? Because I know that the view is going to be looking for that instance variable when it renders itself out. And finally, and this is a cool part, it gives us additional support for creating what are called doubles that we're going to need to test methods that are non-leaf methods. I'll call them non-toy methods. Let's take a look at the code we wish we had and how we would test that code. Here is the beginnings of a little set of RSpec tests. Just to walk you through the file, you'll see this when you do the chips and you look in the exercises in the book, but some of this is boilerplate. Rails helper basically makes sure that RSpec Rails is loaded and some other Rails-specific test stuff. This will be at the beginning of every test file. And then we've got a couple of describe blocks. Describe is basically a way of grouping a set of tests together, and you can sort of nest them arbitrarily. And in particular, we're going to describe what it is like to use this new searching TMDB function. And there's 2 or 3 specific behaviors that are all different facets of that. I'm going to enumerate the behaviors as follows. One of them is the controller method that responds to the search TMDB action will call the model method that actually does the searching. A second thing it will do is it will select the correct view, this new search results view, which doesn't yet exist, for rendering. And it will make sure that it makes the search results available to that view. Right? So this is kind of the breakdown in RSpec terms of the first 2 steps of our happy path. So how do we set this up? Well, let's see. We got to do some basic housekeeping. We need a new route in routes.rb, but we sort of knew how to do that. We're going to say that there's a new view that we're going to use for displaying the results of the search. We know how to do that. We'll just create an empty file for now. And in the controller, we're going to create a placeholder for the new controller action that we're going to call search. But we're not putting any code in there yet because we're going to try as much as possible to follow this sort of religion of do the test first and then do the code afterward to backfill the test. So if we start doing that, we already know that one of the things that's going to have to happen in the controller action is calling this model method, which doesn't exist. But that's not a problem. We're going to pretend that the method exists. And that's a really useful thing to do because by pretending it exists, you have to pretend that you know how you would call it. Like you're basically pretending there's documentation somewhere saying, here's this method, and here's the arguments you have to pass to it, and here's what the return value is going to look like. But the good news is because the method doesn't exist, we actually get to decide what it's going to look like. It's like, what would it be nice to have? So that's why I call it the code you wish you had. I can imagine that it would be nice to have a method that's a class method of movie, like we said, and that we pass it some string for search terms. And what would we really like to have come back from that? Well, we'll come back to this later, but we already have an active record model for movies. How about just an enumerable of movie objects that are pre-populated? That would be nice to have. So we're just going to pretend we have that. How do we do that? We're going to, in our test, simulate submitting the search form to the controller action, right? That's the part of RSpec Rails that gives us things like post, put, and get to actually get us that far. Then, once we're in the controller action, we need to check that it tries to call this non-existent method that we're sort of inventing out of thin air. Of course, the test will fail because there's no code in the controller method. We haven't put any code there yet. And then we'll just put in a little tiny bit of code to satisfy that test and make it pass. And then the question is, how do we do that without actually creating this find in TMDB class method of movie? This is where seams come in. A seam is a place where you can modify the behavior of the app without changing the source code of the app. And this is awesome because in a test, this is exactly what you wish to do. You wish to artificially control some behaviors of the app in order for the test to be able to focus on its one thing, but you'd like to do that without having to change the source code of the app just for testing purposes. Here's how we do it. The key line here is the one with the happy bright colors. So we're going to start filling in the body of our test that says it calls the model method that performs a TMDB search. And check out this cool assertion. Expect movie, and what's movie with a capital M? That's the class, right? Expect it to receive a method call, find in TMDB, with a certain string. So basically, what I'm mocking up here is the example where the controller is about to get a request where the form has been filled in with the word hardware in the search field. And basically what I'm verifying is that if that happens, that should be the same string that gets passed to find in TMDB. Okay, why is this called a method stub? It's called a method stub because this method doesn't exist yet. And in fact, a sort of non-intuitive thing about this is even when we actually sit down and write the method later, in this test, we will still use the method stub because the whole point is to isolate this test from the actual implementation of find in TMDB. A nicer way of saying that is we don't want this test to fail because find in TMDB fails. For this test to fail would mean the controller is not doing the right thing. And the controller's job is to call find in TMDB. The controller's job is not to make sure that find in TMDB is actually implemented correctly. This is the non-intuitive part. And by the way, why are get and expect sort of in the order that they are? Like, why does the expectation come first, even though we said that usually it's first arrange, then act, and then last is assert? This is a little bit subtle, but basically the way that RSpec is going to do this, it's going to set up a spy that listens on method calls to the movie class, and by the end of the test case, which is this line that says end, it will then verify sometime during the test, did someone actually try to make a call to a method with this name? But you can't actually, you have to do that before you do the action that would trigger that method call to happen. Does that make sense? So in some sense, there's a little bit of setting up the state of the world here saying, please spy on method calls because I want to make sure that sometime during this test case, expect, right? I'm expecting this call to happen. It will be an error if this test case finishes and movie find in TMDB has not been called. But if I'm going to say spy on something, I have to spy on it before I do the thing that would cause it to be called. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Now, a thing that I'm sort of glossing over is in real life, find in TMDB probably should return something, right? And we said, well, it'd be nice if it returned, an enumerable, like a collection of movie objects that are already nicely formatted active record objects. And yet here, we're not saying anything about, there's no indication here that find in TMDB is going to return any particular value. But that's okay, right? The reason it's okay is that every spec, every example that begins with the word it, is supposed to test exactly one behavior. So calling movie find in TMDB, that's one behavior. Actually making sure that whatever gets returned from it is going to get passed to the view, that is a separate behavior. So a single tiny little controller method, there's actually multiple things about it that you could test, and each thing is going to get isolated into its own test case so that you can really zero in on which specific aspect of the behavior is not working when a test goes from being green to being red. If we ran the test, it would actually fail until we put just enough code in the controller method to make it pass. And what is that code? Well, remember that whenever we add a form field and we expect it to populate params, we explicitly have to say which params are permitted to go through. So we have a line for that. And then we just grab param search, which we assume we named that field search on the view, and we call movie find in TMDB with search. Again, we know that in real life, find in TMDB is going to return something, and we want to pass that return thing to the view, but I'm trying to do this really by the letter of the law, which is only write enough code to make each test work. And when a new test specifying a new behavior fails, then we go back and add the code to make that new behavior work. In real life, you probably not, sort of be quite this precise about it, but I'm doing this for the sake of example. The point of a seam is to be able to modify the behavior of the app when it's running, but without changing source code in the app. So to be more precise, let's assume for the moment that this implementation of search down here was actually the code in our app. What I mean by a seam in this case is that in real life, if this code ran in the app, movie find in TMDB would really get called. And it would do whatever it does, and it would return whatever it returns, and who knows what that would be. But for the purposes of a test, I want to actually control what gets returned. What I really want to do is I don't want movie find in TMDB to be called at all. I want to pretend that it was called, and I want to say, here, if you called it, this is what you'd get back. We're actually going to do that next. So that's what I mean by, at a point when we want to say, suppose find in TMDB returns whatever, and then the test goes on from there, that we don't have to change the source code in the controller in order to test that condition. That's what I mean by the seam. I think when we talk about doubles and faking a return value, I think it might be more clear. But if it doesn't, please ask me again in like a few slides from now. So that we don't lose sight of the big picture, let's remind ourselves what we're doing here. We're going to call a model method that searches TMDB for a particular string. If a match is found, then we're going to render this new view in order to display the match. So this is how we've gotten so far. We already said we can write an expectation that says, by the time this test case has finished running, the movie class should have received a find in TMDB call. It should have received the argument hardware to that call, because what we're doing is we're submitting a form where search terms equals hardware is what the controller is supposed to parse out. So basically, we're just making sure, is the controller correctly parsing the right thing in params and passing that correct thing to find in TMDB, right? That's sort of that's the boundary of what we care about for the controller to be doing its job. And now if we go on to the part where we said that it will show the results in a search view, that's really two behaviors, because one of them is making sure that it selects the right template for rendering. And the other one is that it makes the results available, right? That whatever data it got from find in TMDB becomes available in the view. And that second part, you can see we're going to fall down on, because right now, our controller code as implemented, yeah, it calls find in TMDB, but it doesn't actually assign the return value to anything. And also, by the way, this function doesn't exist. So there is no return value that we could assign. So that's the part that we have to address next. Before we address that, let's do the simple one first. Okay, so we already know that we expected the movie class to receive find in TMDB. Now, if the behavior we're checking is that the controller selects the correct view for rendering after the fact, once again, now we're going to say allow movie to receive find in TMDB. So what's going on here? Remember in our controller code, the controller code is going to try to call movie find in TMDB, and then presumably it's going to fall off the end of the controller action. We want to check that the correct view is going to be rendered. So in this particular test, and this is important, in this particular test, we don't care what happens with the call to find in TMDB, because what is this particular test case trying to do? It's trying to verify that the correct template is going to be rendered when everything is done. That's the one and only thing this test case cares about. So basically, it's like, let's get everything else out of the way so that we can just focus on checking this one behavior. And getting everything else out of the way basically means, hey, if someone tries to call movie find in TMDB, just pretend the call happened. I don't even care what's returned or whether anything is returned, because at this point in the test flow, it's not going to matter. All I want to make sure of is that the correct template is rendered. And for that, we can use one of the expectations that RSpec Rails provides for us that lets us inspect the response object and say, was the controller about to render that view? So we've said nothing about what information is going to be available to the view, but that's okay because that is a third test, right? And like I said, for the purposes of explanation, I'm really trying to make the tests as ridiculously fine-grained as possible. So The one thing this test cares about is, does it select the correct view for rendering? And under that very restricted view of the world, all we care about is if it tries to call model find in TMDB, just fake an implementation of it. Do nothing, but make the call not be an error. Because remember, we don't have a find in TMDB method right now, right? And even if we did have one right now, we don't really want to call it because that's not what this test is about, right? Get everything out of the way that is irrelevant to the test so that you can focus on the one behavior.